Hello everyone, and welcome to the next webinar from Secura, a Bureau Veritas cybersecurity division. Today we're going to talk about red teaming in operational technology. And together with me, I have a few guests, which will introduce later on. Let me see. So before we start this webinar, I would like to shortly introduce you a little bit to Secura. We were founded in 2000, so we already exist for roughly 20 years, and we do a lot of cybersecurity activities. And the goal from our company is to raise your cyber resilience, either by helping you to manage your security management processes or by doing more technical stuff like penetration and red teaming, either in IT or in OT. And that's what we're going to talk about later today. So we have a few different markets that we serve, and today you're talking to the industrial market group. So we are serving all kind of power and utility companies, logistics, food, transportation, and so on. All kind of companies that have a heavy component also in the cyber physical world with operational technology. And I don't think I have to explain you too much about all the threats that are currently here, but it's all about protecting your crown jewels you see here in the center of this picture. And one of the ways to see how well your crown jewels are protected is with red teaming, actually. So we have a few guests today. On this side of me, we have Philip Westbroek. Maybe you can introduce yourself.
Sure, yeah, I'm Philip Westbroek. I work for Enexis, that's a Dutch regional grid operator. We exist, at least also the predecessors, already for more than 100 years, I think, so that's quite a long time. And we are responsible for distributing energy towards end users.
Right, and on my other side, we have Ben Brücker.
Hi, Ben Brücker. I am the manager for the Secura red teaming services for both IT and OT customers that we have.
Right, and my name is Sjoerd Peerlkamp. I'm heading our industrial market group, so we serve all the industrial companies regarding cybersecurity. So what are we going to talk about today? We would like to start with a little bit an overview about digital security at Enexis. Why is this important, and so on. Then we will continue with red teaming. So what is red teaming actually, and what makes red teaming in OT more specific than generic red teaming? Then we move once again to Enexis. What did we do over there? What kind of value did you get out of it? And also, how do you prepare your company for these type of assessments? So that's in short the overview of the agenda. So I would say let's get started. In the meantime, if you already have any questions, feel free to paste them in the chat. My role as moderator is that I will also browse through those questions and I'll see if I can already pick out some of them during our discussion. If I can't answer them during our discussion, we will do it at the end of the session. And if we still don't have time to answer them at that point in time, we'll answer them after the session, so you'll get a mail from us. Brings me actually to the first topic, and that is digital security at Enexis. So, Philip, can you explain us a little bit more? Why is security important for grid operator? It's all about cables and getting power to the households, right?
Yeah, exactly. It used to be like that, so that's completely right. However, that has changed, I think, in the last 10 years, 15 years maybe. Not sure exactly, yeah, but also our industry, grid operations, faces a lot of digitalization. So many digital systems are introduced in our day-to-day operations. And that also introduces new risks. So that's also what we are facing right now. And because of that, we have to look at resilience of the grid also from a different perspective. So not only from cable perspective, physical infrastructure, but also from digital systems. And that's what we've been doing now for quite some time now already. And of course, we also have regulations like the NIS directive and new regulations that force us also to do exactly that. But a bit of background why this is important. So what is the source of this digitalization? So in the old times, we had some options when we want to expand our network. So we could put more copper in the ground, more cables, more transformers. Of course, we still do that. And it's an expensive option. So for various reasons, costs, but also the availability of technical personnel, it might not always be the best option, but also from an economic perspective, making optimal use of existing infrastructure is also a good idea. But that means that we also introduce new digital systems. And with digital systems, of course, you have also new risks. So that's what this picture tries to visualize. If you, on the left-hand side, have a conventional attacker who wants to cause damage to an electricity grid, He could go to a substation, break in, do any kind of damage there. But a hacker could also go to our central systems where we control all our substations and cause damage in that location.
So the more we introduce in remote monitoring, steering, and so on, yeah, the more a hacker can do as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
So how do you manage those risks then?
Yeah, that's exactly also what we will discuss during this webinar. So this picture, I'm sure that many viewers are familiar with this already, but of course we try to have sufficient risk management. So we try to do all these risk assessments, try to find all the risks that we can, and we visualize them using a bow tie method. So very high level what we do here. So there's an activity that we have to execute, in this case monitoring and controlling substations. There's a risk associated with that activity, and we want to manage that risk. And so what could happen is that, let's say we lose the integrity of the commands we send to our substation, which could of course lead to outages. Right. And that's what we want to avoid. And those risks could start by with certain threats, and this is one very basic example. And so a threat on the left-hand side, that unauthorized access to our network, that could result in this, let's say, event of losing integrity. And we try to avoid that particular threat, or we try to minimize that threat by implementing controls and barriers. And these barriers are exactly what we want to verify during a red teaming test. So of course we have our own activities like monitoring and measuring the effectiveness of all these controls. We have internal audits, we have external audits, but we also want an independent company to, exactly like a hacker would do, evaluate those controls. And that's why we chose to also implement red teaming.
Cool. That brings me actually to red teaming, because, well, it is apparently a way for you to monitor and see the effectiveness of your cybersecurity measures. Mm-hmm. But what is red teaming actually? Can you tell a little bit more about that, Ben?
Yes, definitely. So within red teaming, the goal is to perform a realistic cyber attack against our target organization that emulates real-world threat actors on how they would actually target the organization, how they would make the maximum amount of effect that it would actually diminish the way that you could do your work. So, for example, within within a red teaming test, you go a few steps further than in a traditional pen test or vulnerability assessment. So, if you map it to the NIST cybersecurity framework, where a pen test or vulnerability assessment would mostly cover the identify and the protect part of your cybersecurity, within red teaming, you can do a few more steps where you also test the detection, mitigation, and response capabilities of your actual defenders in your network to make sure that you can test how they would react in a real-world scenario.
Right.
And what we actually do within a red team is that it's a full spectrum operation where pretty much anything is in scope as long as it falls within the rules of engagement that we discuss. So the end goal of a red team will be to cause some high impact event. What's a high impact event? In your traditional IT red teaming, it's mostly about stealing data, encrypting data, making sure that a company can't do their work. But within OT, you have different types of targets that you have. For example, can you depower a substation, or can you have any other real world impact from an IT perspective? And in order to reach those objectives, a red team can do many different things. For example, physical access to your locations, social engineering on the digital side and on the physical side, leaving behind rogue devices inside of your networks, IT and OT networks, and compromising both the IT and the OT networks. And where red teaming and operation technology differs from red teaming in IT is that mostly for an attacker, it's much harder with an OT to just start from, for example, a phishing campaign where they obtain access to a number of systems towards reaching the key objective for the red teaming assessment, the high impact events. That's why red teaming and OT often is a multi-year approach, where first the starting point for most real-world attackers would be to obtain as much information about your company, about your OT networks as possible in a directed collection campaign, because in order to have real-world impact, you do need to have as much process knowledge as possible. The next step would be strategic access, where you actually obtain access to the OT networks, either from IT side or directly on the OT side. And the final part for red teaming would be non-kinetic computer network attacks, where you actually try to reach real-world impact from the digital side. So all these phases combined can have a lot of different attacks that make up the entire red teaming assessment.
That sounds quite risky to me, but maybe Philip can explain later on a little bit how we manage those type of risks. So Philip, actually, why did you want to go this way, and especially in the operational technology domain?
Yeah, so like I explained earlier, we want to verify that all our controls are effective. And of course, we can do that ourselves as well. So we have very good knowledge into these controls. However, asking, let's say, a hacker to actually try to hack us as also a black hat hacker would, I think is also a very effective way to evaluate the effectiveness of these controls. So yeah, sometimes I also envy you guys, because I think it's really a really cool job to do this. So to try to hack a company legally. And indeed, as you mentioned, it could be risky. So rule one, of course, is always to work safely. So personal safety is number one. And also, we don't want to have any operational impact. So we made very clear agreements on that, rules of engagement. So within those boundaries, I think it's very interesting to do this kind of testing. And again, it adds to the existing activities we already do. So on this slide, you see some examples of those activities as a monitoring of control effectiveness, some very local pen testing, sometimes also for a specific part of our operational technology network. So all kinds of examples we do, even also as part of a tender. So if we tender a new component, we also want vendors to, let's say, successfully complete a pen test for that particular component. And that all adds to security within the OT domain, and of course also IT. And in the end, we want to manage all the risks that I mentioned earlier. And so by doing tests like this, and indeed for a number of years, that kind of information will add to the knowledge we have about our control effectiveness. And I think also indeed red teaming is an essential addition to all these activities we already have. And we want to indeed do these tests within these boundaries of safety and also avoidance of impact.
Right. And how do you then actually prepare your company to get the most value out of this? Because, well, this is on top of penetration testing you already do, on top of all kind of control effectiveness monitoring that you already do. How do you prepare your company, and also for the impact it might have to the organization?
Yeah, so that's I think an interesting balance, because we don't want to inform all our colleagues that a test like this is about to happen, because that would defeat the purpose of the whole red teaming test. So we together with we decide on this white team, so the people who are involved in the testing activity on our side, so they know about the test.
So there's a few small group of people within Enexis that already know that this is happening.
Exactly,
and there's frequent alignment between Secura and your white team about every attack we're going to perform.
Exactly, and also in a broader sense, I think most colleagues directly involved in this particular topic, so security, know that something is about to happen or something will happen maybe in the coming year, but that's about it for the general colleagues. But some the white team colleagues are involved on a more detailed level, also because we want the white team to be able to, let's say, make changes during the testing activities. So let's say the red team doesn't find any vulnerabilities, we can give them a leg up if necessary. And that's also one of the goals of the white team. But and in addition, we also want, let's say, to get the most value out of this red team test. And we achieve that, for example, by giving some information beforehand, that you don't need to find all that information by yourself, like an ordinary hacker would have to do. So some information, some inside information we can already give. And that also enables us to, let's say, focus the red teaming activities on particular areas which we find most interesting.
So if our hackers would like to turn off the power somewhere in our country, then there's probably a whole chain of activities they need to do. So they might start with phishing or some physical access to get into your IT networks. From there, they might move to the OT networks, and from there, they need to find the right substations, get access to it, and make sure that they can do switching commands in there. And if the phishing attempt wouldn't be successful, is then the whole red team stopped because then we didn't reach our goals? Do we stop over there, or how do we continue in that case?
I think that's a good example where we would give a leg up to the red team. So
a leg up is kind of, you assume that we succeeded in the first part, although we didn't.
Exactly.
But we still execute the next steps then.
Yeah, exactly. And that's also what Ben mentioned earlier, that we have, of course, the IT environment that's also connected to the internet. And in addition, Enexis has an OT environment, like many other companies who have a physical process that needs to be controlled. And there's a very high wall in between. Let's call it a high wall. All kinds of firewalls, all kinds of security mechanisms. And of course, the holy grail in our case would be to pass that wall, to bypass that wall as a hacker. And we'll get into that later, but that's also one of the goals of the red team exercise we did initially. And so the first red teaming we did in 2021.
And maybe to add to that, as Philip also mentioned, from our side as red teaming provider, business continuity is key. We do want to increase your security, and we don't want to cause any incidents to your actual business process that you have. So that's what you often see for red teaming and OT, that the assessment is more on the red teaming side, the more you are in the IT domain or the IT components of your OT networks. And it goes much more towards a more purple teaming assessment, the closer you get to the OT components, because as a hacker, we are not the specialist on your network, on your specific assets. And our time is relatively limited, of course. So the closer we get to OT assets, we need to work together more, we need to get more information in order to make sure that we can perform the right amount of testing without having any impact on the business continuity. And the same also with, for example, personal safety. Social engineering is a really relevant way on how to get into the different farms, for example. But the personal safety of our personnel is also important. So there might be some collaboration with our clients to make sure that everything is done in a safe way.
Right. And the role of a distribution system operator all says it by his name. It's distributed across the country. You have many different substations around the country. The first scenario we talked about is more getting from IT to OT, etc. But if somebody physically would break into such a system, they can also access the network already, and maybe already directly into the OT network. Do you also investigate that type of scenarios?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we do that as well. So actually, that was also part of the first red teaming test. And so accessing one of our substations and see what kind of damage you can cause there. And we'll get into the lessons learned later. But of course, that's another interesting balance we try to find as a grid operator. So we know that people can break into substations, and we know that after they do that, they can cause damage with whatever means, with conventional means.
Physical damage or more.
Exactly. Yeah. So you have to find the right balance there as well. And that's exactly also what we discussed with the red team. So what kind of damage could you cause within that station, which is interesting, but what we find more interesting is what kind of damage could you cause within that station towards, let's say, a central environment or towards other stations. And that's also where we focus our security efforts on.
So if you already get physical access to such a substation, you can also do manual switching. You can also damage the transformers and so on. So I would say hacking attempts to that local substation are not that important in that case. But if you can hack another substation from within that single substation, then the business impact will be much higher.
So that's another interesting balance we need to find.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the lessons learned from the 2 years of red teaming in OT that we now do?
So I think also information sharing when it comes to security is very important. However, there's a third balance. So we need to find what kind of information we can share. So that's also I prepared some lessons learned together with you. So of course we cannot share all the details, but I think still we can we can inform the listeners about some interesting findings. And some of them I think are quite obvious, maybe others not so much. But the main findings are listed on this slide and the next one. So we have some findings when it comes to network segmentation. So the red team found some, let's say, configuration improvements that could be made to network segmentation, both within the station, but also mainly in the station. But I think another very interesting lesson learned was that network segmentation was a very effective control.
Yes.
So there were some findings to improve, but in general, network segmentation also causes, let's say, containment of attacks exactly as you would expect. The same goes for multi-factor authentication. So that's quite an effective control when it comes to preventing access to systems. And also, I think the alignment between the IT and the OT security operation centers. So right now we have two operation centers, both focused on IT and OT. And there's also already a lot of cooperation, but this red team exercise showed again that it's important to share information about things they see, strange things, and also to act on that. So I think these are the good findings we did. And the next one, about network segmentation, there were some findings, but also these detection capabilities. So we, the security operations centers, they saw many of the attack attempts that the red team did, but not all of them. And I think that in itself is already quite interesting. So this finding also enabled us to increase the number of use cases we have, and to add use cases to our security operations center, and also to think about what kind of activities do we want to see. Now, and of course, social engineering remains effective. You see that with these rogue devices. So it turned out to be possible to leave a rogue device. And
what would be the impact of such a rogue device? So.
Now, in this case, it wouldn't have been a very high impact, but of course, such a device really worries us when it comes to stations.
Yes.
And so earlier we discussed people physically breaking into a substation, and they could also leave devices like this, and not in one station, but in many stations. This is a very well-known risk, and so you have to look at this, how you want to prevent it. And in this particular case, it was interesting because you could retrieve information from our, in this case, IT network. But it was not a huge risk immediately. But of course, all information that hackers can retrieve from your network is too much. And finally, also security awareness. So again, about social engineering, still a very effective method to attack, and phishing, tailgating, whatever you want to call it, walking behind people through a door. So that's also what we saw during the red team.
Yeah, and I think if I can conclude there, that part is that especially the security awareness and behavior helped with initial access and gaining an initial foothold.
Yeah.
And the further you get towards the operational technology, the harder it is to exploit, let's say, security awareness weaknesses or vulnerabilities.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. There's also a question coming in about how noisy was the red team actually, and was special care taken to be as covert as possible. So maybe we should start with Ben.
Yeah. So from our side, the initial goal of red team is always to be as stealthy as possible, because you do want to test the actual detection and response capabilities of an organization. There will always be detections, there will always be some responses in the end, and that's also a good thing to happen, because in the end you want to test how does the blue team react to certain attacks that you do, and if they don't see anything, there's also relatively little to learn from the procedures that are going on.
Are we going to make more noise if they don't see us, just to see where the threshold is?
It depends on the agreement that we have with our client and what the main learning objective is. So by default, the goal is to stay as silently as possible, and then during a later purple teaming session at the end, talk with the blue team through the entire attack and to figure out, like, hey, where could you have detected us? What are you already maybe detecting but not alerting on? And there's learning opportunities. If there's also a learning objective about figuring out how does the process within the organization work once an attack has been detected and it looks realistic, then we can either accidentally, because there's a really great blue team, or on purpose be some more noise to make sure that some attacks actually get detected and triggered.
Yeah.
How did you perceive that on the Enexis side?
No, that's very interesting. So what Ben just told us reminded me of one of the findings of the Security Operations Center. And so one of the scenarios we wanted to evaluate was a malicious insider. So a person who has, in this case, a laptop which is used to change configurations in the OT environment. And one of your red team members was working with that laptop. He did some suspicious activities, and our Security Operations Center, they notified it. They noticed this, and they also notified the manager responsible for that laptop. So I think that was a very interesting finding, and it also shows that, let's say, the Security Operations Center use cases in this particular case were sufficient.
Right.
And so I think that's a very interesting finding, but also other activities. So also they were not very noisy at that point in time, were not discovered. I won't go into the details right now because I think that's too much information. But that also helped us to, as I mentioned earlier, improve our Security Operations Center use cases.
Right.
Yeah.
Hey, and at the beginning we already told that you work based on scenarios. So there are certain goals that you want to achieve, but there are so many different ways to get into those goals. Is there any framework or standard that we use to actually test the most relevant parts, or how do you approach this?
Yeah, definitely. So as a red team, the goal is to emulate a real-world attacker. And one of the frameworks that we use is the so-called attack matrix created by the MITRE organization, where they map real-world tools, techniques, and procedures from real-world threat actors to a matrix of specific attacks that can be done, that can be emulated, and that a company might want to protect themselves against. So with that information in mind, we can create scenarios that are realistic because they have happened in the real world, or they are in line with real-world attacks. Right. And use them to perform our attacks in a similar fashion.
Yeah.
And luckily, a few years ago, the ICS-specific matrix got added to the MITRE attack matrix, and that can also be used for red teaming attacks within OT environment, because now there's a very specific focus on that.
Cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's open the floor for further questions. So we have a Q&A session open. I can enter some more questions into the chat, actually. I see that somebody already spotted a rubber ducky here in the room, so that's valid. Good comment. Another question is that Enexis seems to be pretty mature in all kind of controls, including network segregation, including more procedural controls, and so on and so on. Would red teaming also make sense for less mature companies, and why yes or why no? Actually, maybe start with that.
Yeah, so it is difficult to give one clear answer for that, because it all depends on the learning objectives that you have. In order to perform red teaming assessment, you do already want to have, for example, your own SOC. You do want to have relatively mature network and security measures, because otherwise it is quite a hefty effort and budget probably that you would need to perform such an attack for attacks that you probably won't be able to detect anyway. So if you're not yet on a relatively mature level, or you don't have your own detection measures in place, then a normal pen test or vulnerability assessment might make more sense than a full-on red team.
Yeah. Yes, the other way around, red teaming is also about realistic scenarios.
Yes.
So if you want to know which vulnerabilities in your network are most relevant for real-world scenarios, could this be a way forward, or do you then still recommend to do normal pen testing or maybe scenario-based pen testing?
Then more in a more light variant of red teaming, where you do perform specific scenarios, and there's a bit less focus on staying under the radar and not getting detected, but more focus on what would an actual attacker be able to reach within your network to make to give you an awareness of what would happen in a real-world scenario.
Yeah, I think this is a very good question, because indeed, you need to have some maturity when it comes to cybersecurity. You shouldn't be completely new. So it's important to at least understand the controls you have implemented, their effectiveness. However, I do think that red teaming, regardless of your maturity, it adds value. And why I'm saying that is that you see many regulations nowadays. So many essential services or important also are now assigned as operators of performance services by the NIST directive. And what I very compliancy ticks in the boxes. And of course, in many cases, that's only paper. That's only, let's say, on paper, you might be compliant to certain regulations. But with red teaming, you will do actual testing of the effectiveness of your controls, very similar to pen testing. So that's why I think that also red teaming also has added value if you, let's say, are a bit less mature when it comes to cybersecurity. Yeah.
Do you agree?
I agree, definitely.
Nice. Hey, we also spoke about the multi-year program. There's also a question coming in about that one.
Yeah.
Do you then do exactly the same thing every year to see if there's improvements, or is there, do you test different things over
there? Good point. So we test different things. As Ben mentioned earlier, we have this IT environment, OT environment, and a connection in between. And we want, of course, to avoid as much as possible people bypassing this protection layer between IT and OT, and that was the focus of the first test we did in 2021, combined with the test in the substations. Last year we did very limited testing activities, but this year we have a quite big scenario also to focus purely on the OT environment, and with many different aspects. Not possible to tell any details right now, but together with Secura we are building this scenario, which we think is most realistic, and which we think also adds the most value to evaluate, let's say, our digital resilience. But every year there will be a specific focus on, let's say, part of our digital infrastructure.
Yeah, and as we work longer together, you also see that we get to know the company better.
Yeah.
And it might be so you evolve actually the depth of your testing, and also, as the maturity of Enexis grows, we also have to step up every year to come up with new creative ways of hacking into
it. I think you will never be completely finished with cybersecurity. So I think everyone knows that. So this will be an important activity for the foreseeable future.
There's also a question more related to privacy. They say that a lot of tools. Let's see the question. In security, there is a lot of concern about privacy. A lot of tools see a lot. What is your advice for organization regarding privacy? I don't think that's part of the red teaming and OT scope.
No, not really. But of course, privacy is quite a difficult topic. You always have to think about this. You don't want to blame people, or you want to point fingers to colleagues. And that's what we looked at also during the red teaming exercise. But exactly, privacy is mainly also an issue in the IT environment. However, I do understand this concern, and we try to address that, and so far this went well. So we always tell everyone involved, also afterwards, it's never the goal to point fingers to someone who did something wrong. We only want to learn from this. So also, indeed. So I also don't remember receiving names from the red team. So we don't have any names of people who clicked on phishing mails, for example. They most likely will be there, but they are not in the report, because that's not what we want to hear. We want to know approximately which department needs to get some more attention when it comes to awareness, but we don't want to address privacy issues.
This is also an interesting one. So in the financial sector, they decided to take a sector-based approach with TIBER, threat intelligence-based ethical red teaming. Do you see any value for other sectors as well? You see an initiative of Zorro in the healthcare. What about critical infrastructure?
Well, I didn't know about Zorro yet, but I do know about TIBER, and that also inspired us to do this. So I think that was in 2016. And I fully agree, because the energy grid is really interconnected. So all parties in the Netherlands, but also in Europe, they are all connected to each other. And I think eventually we will cooperate much more in this area. And so we already talk quite a lot to each other. So all the grid operators in Europe, they know each other. They talk to each other about cybersecurity, but also doing tests with scenarios, I think, will even become mandatory because of a new netcode, or cybersecurity netcode for energy business. So I think eventually we will cooperate a lot more than we do now.
And you see that on, for example, the NIS2 topic, the regulation, cybersecurity regulation that's coming in Europe. You see that a lot of companies focus more on the process side, the ISO-27K processes. Do you have your risks inside, and do you take appropriate measures to limit or to lower those risks? But red teaming could be a quite effective way to validate if your controls are actually valid and working.
I think it's an important addition to what most companies already do. And again, I think red teaming is a very good way to at least avoid compliance-driven behavior. So with red teaming, you will see the actual quality of your controls. And so, yeah.
And also what makes sector-wide initiatives such as TIBER and also very interesting is that one, you would have a common framework that all the companies who are involved agree on, both the company that gets tested and also the red teaming provider and the threat intelligence provider. There's a common framework. That also means that tests can be comparable between organizations, and also information sharing is part of those frameworks to make sure that the entire sector gets to learn from it.
Yeah.
So yeah, in general, I think it's a very good approach to have those initiatives in place.
Yeah.
Super.
Yeah, and just one comment there. Of course, in the Netherlands, we already have this, let's say, nationwide crisis exercises. It's not really red teaming,
Yes.
but it's also red teaming and crisis management exercises are sometimes very comparable to each other. So when it comes to cooperation, already a lot of things happen when it comes to crisis management.
Right.
Yeah.
Super. Given the time, that also brings us towards the end of this webinar. Any remaining questions will be answered by us via email, so feel free to submit a few as well. Furthermore, feel free to reach out to us. And at the end of the webinar, please stay on the line, because as soon as we close the webinar, there will be a kind of evaluation form which we would like you to answer. So that gives us a little bit of an idea, if you like it, what type of topics you want to have on all webinars, and how we can improve these kind of stuff to make it most valuable for you. So thank you all for joining, and see you on the next webinar with Secura. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Philip.
Yes.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
Yeah.